Welcome to the Talking the Talk podcast, where we'll be exploring items of automotive technology and their design journey into mass production. I'm Kevin Reid, founder of the Ireland Made platform, where we celebrate stories of Irish transport, past and present, and this is our podcast. I'm very happy to welcome my co-host, automotive engineering consultant Mike Keane. Mike develops sustainable transport solutions for industry and has extensive automotive career. Having previously worked for Williams Formula One in their advanced engineering division, has led projects for such as Ford, Nissan, Land Rover and Aston Martin, and what is most impressive for me, he worked on the baddies car for the James Bond movie Spectre, the Jaguar CX-75. In our exploration of the origins of automotive technology, in each episode we're going to discuss cars that range from the 1921 German Rumpler right up to what Tesla and Lucid are doing today. So today we're going to begin with aerodynamics. It's good to be here, Mike. What are aerodynamics? They're the smooth surfaces of a car that allow it to go faster. Am I right?
Yeah, in effect, that's one of the main things of it, Kevin. So aerodynamics is the study of how air flows over a moving body. So in our case, a moving vehicle. And if you allow that when a vehicle travels from one point to another, it has to pass through the air and therefore has to move that air out of the way, which causes a resistance to the car.
Right.
So the job then of the aerodynamicist is to engineer the surfaces of the car so that at sort of an entry level, it just helps the car going forward. And at its very best, it actually aids the performance of the car. And then there are a number of factors that the engineer is playing with. So you have the wind speed, you have air density, you have the design of the car, and then you have the speed of the car. Now, if you allow that, as you said, the speed of the car is one of the things that we're looking at. So you can think about fuel economy, things like that. But let's talk about speed. So the engineer is trying to achieve speed. So therefore, of all those factors, the surface of the car is the only thing that the engineer can manipulate.
Right. Yeah, I never thought of it in those terms before. That it is a manipulative area that the engineer can make things happen by using different shapes and foils. Great.
Exactly.
So, okay, great. So what are we going to look at here?
So today we're going to look at an area of aerodynamics called drag. So there are a number of different areas that the engineer is trying to manipulate. Drag is probably the area that's most easily understood. And in fact, it was the area that the car engineers first turned their attention to. So if you think, the easiest way to visualize drag is to think about a boat traveling through the water. So as a boat travels through the water, it leaves a wake behind it. How large that wake is or how turbulent that wake is a function of the design of the hull and also the speed of the boat as it goes forward.
Right. So just fleshing that out a bit, is drag that much of a hindrance? Why don't you just lash a V12 engine in it and away you go, a good big powerful engine?
Yes, it's a good point. So it's always a relative thing anyway, right? So no matter what point you start with, so how big or how small the engine is, it's always a relative difference if you can gain some aero gain back again. But a really good example is the Shelby Daytona and the Shelby Cobra. So the Shelby Daytona is effectively a Shelby Cobra with a radically different bodywork. So designed specifically for aerodynamics, specifically for reduction of drag. The Cobra had a 4.7 litre engine, big V8 engine in it. And when it was redesigned into the Daytona, effectively everything is, more or less the same. The chassis is the same, powertrain is the same. But it brought the top speed of the car from 260 kilometers an hour to over 300 kilometers an hour.
Wow. So why is speed so significant to drag then?
Yeah, speed's very significant. So we talked about, a few minutes ago, sort of the different factors, the air density and speed of the vehicle. So if we look at the equation for how we calculate drag, you can actually see all of these elements in the equation. So the equation is, if I call it out to you, it's rho v squared CdA. Sounds a little bit obscure, but it's actually not too bad. You can break down those elements. So half rho v squared CdA.
Just to stop you there, Mike. So rho is, is RHO, right?
Yep, that's absolutely right. Yeah. So it's the Greek letter R. So engineers and physicists love Greek, right? So they're always throwing in Greek letters.
The rest of us don't speak Greek. So.
That's right. So rho represents the density of the fluid. So in this case, the air density. V represents the velocity, the speed. And then the last element, CDA, is made up of two parts. CD is called a coefficient of drag. I can come back to that.
Yeah.
And A is the frontal area. So the frontal area is, as you look at the front of the car, that shape of the car is being moved through the air. So if you think of it in terms of, if a light was shone on the front of the car, what's the silhouette that would be on a wall behind it? So all of that shadow, all of that area has to move through the air. So we multiply all of these factors together, but the V element, the velocity element, is squared. It's multiplied by itself. So it has a doubling up effect. It has a more significant effect on the result, and also because it's squared, the effect rises exponentially. So for every extra kilometer of an hour of speed you try to achieve, you get a significantly larger drag, and that's because of that squared element. Right. We're as we record this, Kevin, we're a number of weeks into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and as a result of that, fuel prices have risen very dramatically. So a number of weeks ago, Eamon Ryan, who's the Minister for the Environment, Climate and Communications in Ireland, made a statement that one of the ways that people could combat rising fuel prices is if they just reduce their speed. And he made a statement saying that we know at certain speed we use more fuel, so if you reduce your speed, you can reduce your fuel consumption. That's basics. The basic physics that he's talking about there is that drag equation. So what he's actually talking about, and obviously put into layman terms, but what he's talking about there is the effect of that V squared element in that equation, that the increase of velocity massively affects the drag.
Okay, so just to break it down further, can you explain then how there's a coefficient of drag in the equation to calculate drag? Right. That's
it sounds a bit confusing. So the coefficient of drag is it's a non-dimensionless figure. So if I said to you that a typical coefficient of drag is 0.3, I can't say to you, Kevin, it's 0.3 meters or 0.3 newtons. It's a non-dimensionless number. So it's a dimensionless number, I should say. So its purpose is to be a comparative figure. So it looks at the relative design efficiency of two different cars. It looks at their how efficient the two aerodynamic designs were, and it means that we can compare two completely different cars. So you can compare a Mini and a Ferrari. You can compare a van and a 4x4. So you can compare the design efficiency of those. The size of the car is not actually a factor because that's considered in that frontal area element that we talked about already.
Right. Okay. So that's the science. Let's get back to the cars. What were the influences for the early people working on aerodynamics?
Yeah, as you can imagine, airplanes. Aerospace was the aerialist influence. So after World War I, there was a significant influx of aerospace engineers and aviation engineers into the automotive industry. So throughout World War I, there had been big advances in the understanding of aero surfaces on vehicles, and then that started to be applied to cars. Interestingly, actually, in the sort of 1920s, there was also some influence that came from the locomotive industry. So late 20s, early 30s, there were a lot of streamliner trains. Yeah. The Mallard is the example in the UK, the famous the Atlantic series A4. And those trains had top speeds of over 200 kilometers an hour, which was significantly faster than the cars at the time. So actually, at that point in time, they were sort of leading the way in terms of actually how streamlined design was taking place.
And you see images of those trains, they're completely sheathed in the bodywork.
That's right, yeah.
Streamlined beyond belief.
Yeah, that's right.
And now we're going to Germany, I believe, for your first example.
That's absolutely right. So the German engineers will appear over and over again, particularly in the early days, actually. So the very first place we go is we look at a car called the Rumpler Tropfenwagen. Rumpler Tropfenwagen, yeah, and I apologize to our German friends for my pronunciation. So Edward Rumpler was a German aircraft engineer, and he decided to set up a car company, decided to create his own car using the techniques that he had learned in the aerospace industry. And his car is called the Tropfenwagen. Now, the direct translation for that is teardrop car.
Right.
So at that point in time, it was well understood that the teardrop shape was the most aerodynamically efficient shape. So sort of a rounded front leading back to quite a thin taper at the rear. Yeah. And if you think of an airplane wing, a cross section of an airplane wing, the front, the leading edge of the wing is quite rounded. The tail, the airfoils at the rear are tapered to a thin point. Mm-hmm. So he took that principle and he designed the whole car around those ideas. So if you look at the side view, you have this aerofoil shape. Mm-hmm. If you look down on top in plan view, you also have this aerofoil shape. So the car almost has a fuselage like you'd see in an airplane underneath it. Mm. Interestingly, it was one of the first cars then, or I think the first car that had curved windows, sort of curved glass.
A curved windscreen or curved down the sides?
Both, actually.
Both, wow.
Yeah, both, yeah. So until that point, the cars just had flat, plain panes of glass. So to achieve this teardrop shape, he developed curved glass. And wind tunnel tests showed that it had a coefficient of drag of 0.2. Now, that was on a 20% wind tunnel model. Wind tunnel model results don't translate directly to the full scale car very easily. There's lots of losses in the detail of the car as it expands up, and then things like the effect of the road moving beneath the car, the effect of the wheels turning, that's not taken into account. But nonetheless, comparing it to other cars at its time, like 0.2 is very significant. And if it were achieved today in a wind tunnel, it would still be remarkably good in a wind tunnel today.
Very good. So even back from 1921 to here we are to 2022, a very good example.
Absolutely.
So as we said at the outset, this podcast is about how that technology moved into mass production. So what vehicle takes us into mass production?
Yeah. So the very first car that we talked about that had mass produced that was designed for aerodynamics is the Tatra 77. Tatra were a very innovative company, a Czechoslovakian company or Czech company, mm-hmm. Still in existence, actually building trucks. But in the 1930s, they were very advanced in what they were doing. So again, another German engineer, this one called Paul Jarre, again from aviation. He had been the chief engineer with the Zeppelin airship company. Oh. He joined Tatra as a design consultant. And he designed the bodywork that had this teardrop principle again. So sort of a very rounded front and back to a tapered rear. But he put a lot of emphasis on reducing the bonnet line or the hood line. So he wanted to get the sort of the entry of the air onto the vehicle to be as easy as possible, as smooth as possible. In order to get that bonnet line down, it actually promoted the engine to the rear axle. So it became a rear engine car. And the moving the engine to the rear of the car had a number of sort of aero gains, aero benefits. So one was that the front of the car, the very front layer, not the front layer, but the front hood can be dropped down lower. But also, because the engine was at the back, there was no exhaust system or cooling system running underneath the car, which meant they could have quite a flat floor. And air passing under the floor is a big contributor to drag as well. So he was able to get that gain from it. And then the last thing is, because it had this teardrop effect, he was able to create a negative pressure area behind the car, so a low pressure area that actually draws air out of the car. And that was able to aid the engine. Now, the engine was an air-cooled engine, so it was able to aid the cooling of the engine. Yeah. And we see this over and over again. We see this example where rear-cooled engines, so rear engine cars are air-cooled because of this link where the negative pressure aids the cooling of the car.
So we're talking cars like Porsche 911, Volkswagen Beetle.
Yep, Chevrolet Corvair.
Does it have any effect on the modern Twingo? That is an engine in the back, doesn't it? Twingo.
Yeah, it does. So the Twingo is a water-cooled engine. So it will have an effect in that the negative pressure is drawing the air out. But in this case here, what we're specifically able to talk to is it promoted air-cooled engines, so engines that didn't have a water cooling.
I have you. Fair enough. Thank you. So I think we're moving up into the 1930s now in terms of design.
Right. So the next, yeah, absolutely, the next thing then was, the next major change is interesting. So it was discovered in the 1930s, but it didn't really come into effect until probably the 1950s. And that was, again, a German aircraft engineer called Wunderwald Kamm. So he did some experimentation on the teardrop shape in wind tunnels in the 1930s. So the teardrop shape, we know it's quite effective. The engineers knew it was quite effective. But one of the big disadvantages of that teardrop shape is, in order to have this large taper at the rear of the vehicle, it required a lot of mass and a lot of structure back at the vehicle to kind of keep this tail going. So his experiments, he worked out that actually, if the teardrop shape was truncated, so in other words, you cut the teardrop about 50% of the way along of its length, that effectively the air followed the same trajectory that it would have if the bodywork structure was in place.
So it was already being funneled in that direction, so it didn't matter if the car was cut off as much as you say by 50%.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so the air kept following that same air path.
Yeah.
So we got nearly all of the same drag production that we would have got with the teardrop shape, but all of that mass, all of that structure didn't need to be there. Mm-hmm. So that was quite a significant piece of learning and significant piece gain in terms of how the structure of the vehicle was linked to the aerodynamic design. But funny enough, it wasn't really picked up. There was a few tentative attempts to use it. So the Nash Air Flight was one car in the US in the 1940s, sort of a conservative version of it. And it was really the 1950s, the sports racers of the late 50s, the likes of the Ferrari 250 GTO, the Porsche 904, the Aston Martin DB212. So cars designed for sports racing. So they were all coupe shapes, and they all had this very sharp cutaway at the rear. So the bodywork suddenly had a vertical plane at the rear.
So would that be a little bit like what's on the back of this Ferrari F40?
Yeah, exactly. So exactly, there's a vertical plane right. So it's just cut off at the back. Okay. The car that I think most properly used the technique that Kamm had developed was that Shelby Daytona. Actually, we spoke about a moment ago. So if you look at the side profile of the Daytona, it does still have quite an elongated tail, and then about 50% of the way it's just this vertical cut off on the plane. And Peter Brock designed that. So Peter, the designer for Shelby, American, and I think he discovered some technical papers in the Ford archive on the work Kamm can do. Oh,
very good. And now you've worked with Peter Brock, haven't you?
That's right. Yeah, I've been lucky enough to work alongside Peter on a number of programs. So fascinating guy. He was General Motors' youngest designer. He was still a teenager when he designed the concept for what would become the Chevrolet Corvair C2, the Stingray. And then from there, he went to join Shelby American, where he designed the Daytona. After that, he ran his own team. BRE, Brock Racing Enterprises, was a works Datsun racing team, designed hang gliders, and he's still active today designing Aerovolt, which is an aerodynamically designed race transporter trailer.
Sorry, hang on a minute. There's a company that designs. Give me that again.
Yeah, so they're transport trailers, so vehicle transport trailers, but they're aerodynamically designed.
Who knew there was such a market? So the Shelby Daytona was actually designed for motorsport. So does motorsport have much of an influence on aerodynamics? I'm thinking of wings and things, doesn't it?
Yeah. So you would obviously think of all of those, the wings and the spoilers that you could see. When we're looking for speed, which is a big element of what aerodynamics is about, the motorsport is significantly influential. One particular example is if you look at NASCAR in the 1960s. So in the 1960s, the Chrysler Group were running two different cars. They were running the Plymouth Roadrunner and the Dodge Charger. Now, they were both big engine cars, big powerful engine cars, but very bluff body. They were blunt tools, let's say. Yeah. And the Chrysler Group wanted to improve the aerodynamics of them for Daytona, for the high-speed ovals in the US. So they set about creating what's called a homologation special. Now, this is a technique that's been used multiple times by car manufacturers over the years, whereby the standard vehicle is converted into a special version that's a high-performance version. The manufacturer then sells those as a small series limited production. The fact that they're now a production vehicle means that the manufacturer can then use that architecture or that design of car to comply with the motorsport rules, which require the car to be based on a production car.
Gotcha. Nice.
So Chrysler then took the Dodge and the Plymouth, and they designed really extreme bodywork on them. So a nose cone that was tapered to the front, almost comically high rear wings at the back.
Yeah, it looked like it was like literally on a platform at the back. It's a huge thing. Yeah,
that's right. It looks like a big grab handle. Right?
Very good.
And then things like they also put effort into changing the profile of the likes of the door pillars. Right? So a lot of detail went in there, and then the Daytona Charger, the Dodge Charger Daytona, then was the first car to circulate Daytona at over 200 miles an hour.
Wow. Okay, that's something else. Now, just to double check on that, the Chrysler Group had was the Plymouth Superbird and the Dodge Charger Daytona.
Yeah, that's right. So the Plymouth Roadrunner, then as a special, they then called it the Superbird. So the Roadrunner was a bird called the Superbird. The Dodge Charger, then they sold it as the Dodge Charger Daytona.
Okay. Now, when we were doing our research for this podcast, you were telling me about the VW Scirocco being important in aerodynamics, and I immediately thought of the shape of the VW Scirocco. Not a car I'd associate with aerodynamics, but it's quite sharp lined. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. It really doesn't spring to mind. But actually, I mentioned there a moment ago that the Chrysler Group had spent time looking at things like the door pillars. So that's actually a nice segue into the Scirocco. Scirocco was launched in '74, very sharp lines, very typical of Giugiaro, the designer of the time. In the late 60s, Volkswagen put a huge amount of effort into looking at the aerodynamic effect of the details that were on cars. So up until that point, aerodynamics was mainly concerned with sort of the macro. It's concerned with the overall shape of the car. Volkswagen started to look at all of the small details, the wing mirrors, the wipers, door handles, roof gutters, even the panel gaps.
So they're like the gap on the bonnet between the wings and the bonnet. They're literally, wow, okay.
The gap exactly between each one of the panels, that's right. And what they discovered is the accumulation of drag of all of these components was almost as much as the drag that was being created by the whole car itself.
The shape.
So they then set about turning that into a set of design principles for the car, whereby all of these small details were really concentrated on, and they called it detail optimization. And as a result, then what went before then became known as shape optimization. So the large scale stuff is the shape optimization, the real small stuff is the detail optimization. The Scirocco then was launched. It was their first car to be launched with this principle of detail optimization in '74. And it had a coefficient of drag of 0.28, and that's a figure that even today would be more than acceptable.
Wow, very good. So did that affect the styling of the car much if the emphasis was so much on getting the drag down?
Yeah, so I mean, in this conversation, we're talking about aerodynamics and we're talking about the exterior of the car. There's obviously a link between what the aerodynamicist is trying to do and what the stylist is trying to do. Quite often, those two teams are sort of in conflict in principle. I don't mean day to day. I just mean in principle they're in conflict. Quite often, the designer is looking for features on the car to accentuate the style. The aerodynamicist is looking to take away drag components. But actually, what detail optimization did was it brought these two teams together more than they had ever been, really, because the details that the aerodynamicist is trying to remove or eliminate, the likes of the door pillars and the roof gutters, that's all of the functional stuff that the stylists really don't want to have on the car in the first place. Right. So suddenly they're working very much hand in glove to take all of these components off and get these much more streamlined designs.
Right. So now that they're working together, where did this newfound collaboration take the designs?
Yeah. So I think if you look at the Ford Sierra, 1984, it was probably at that point the pinnacle of how those two teams then came together. So up until that point, the predecessor to the Sierra was the Cortina, very typical 3-box design car. And the Sierra had what was at the time called a jelly mold design. So it wasn't, it didn't go down well with the buying public, actually, because it was so radical. But it was very much designed on aerodynamic principles, including detail optimization. The other thing, actually, with the Sierra is it also had a closed grille, or sort of the upper portion of the grille was closed. So there was a fascia panel above the bonnet.
Above the bumper. Above the bumper. I remember that because it was the first car that it came down right to the bumper, and then you had the little Ford logo in the middle. So
that's right. Yeah, and the grille is under the bumper. The grille opening for the radiator is under the bumper. And that's a principle that's used in most cars today, where it actually the majority of the air cooling for the cooling system goes through a grille opening that's below the bumper line.
And would that, obviously, not obviously, but would that be good for fuel efficiency? Does that help?
Absolutely, yeah. So most of this conversation we've talked about speed, but actually speed and fuel efficiency are, when it comes to aerodynamics, they work together. So gains in speed are also gains in fuel efficiency, because what you're doing is you're asking less of the car. So you're asking
pushing
the engine. Exactly, yeah.
Very good. So that must be now very relevant in the world of electric vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see that coming back, and I think the first car that that really started to, I think, pull these principles together in terms of electrics was the Honda Insight. Sorry, it was a hybrid; it wasn't electric.
Right.
But it was the start of where the electric vehicles were going.
And that car had a cam back, didn't it?
It did, absolutely. It had a cam back, yeah. So what's interesting is if you look at side view, you have that cam back. So you have a teardrop shape, you have the cam back. But it also had it in plan view as well, the cam back in plan view. So looking down on the roof, the car tapered in at the rear and had a vertical panel. And in order to achieve this, the rear track of the car, so how far apart the rear wheels are, that rear track is narrower than the front wheels, and that allowed them to get this tapered effect in.
Next time I see one, I'm going to have to look at it in that way, because I've never looked at one in that way before.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's one of those sort of modern classics that people kind of don't notice, actually.
Yeah. So that means that, taking this further, then electric cars must need less cooling than combustion, or do need less cooling than combustion engine cars. So that would in turn be very good for aerodynamics.
Yeah, so it's funny with and in a later talk, actually, we'll talk about cooling, right? So, but in electric cars do need less energy, less heat energy rejected. So there's less of a total requirement for cooling. Although, having said that, there are often more cooling systems or more complex cooling systems on them. But what that means then is that the electric vehicles, people would often recognize that electric vehicles don't have a big grille opening on the front of them. The cooling is happening in that lower portion underneath the bumper, but there's a synergy. There's a real strong synergy between that, the aerodynamic need to reduce drag, to reduce the resistance of the vehicle, which is a real strong factor in electric vehicles in order for them to achieve their range. So there's a real synergy between that aerodynamic design to reduce the drag and the cooling of the vehicle and the styling of the vehicle. And it's funny because I always think that's very reminiscent of the air-cooled vehicles that we talked about sort of 50 or 60 years ago. So where the powertrain position, the powertrain type, the cooling type, the aerodynamics and the styling are all actually working hand in hand.
Excellent. So that was very informative, Mike. Very fascinating. And I think, taken from our conversation, the one that gets me the most is the Kamm effect. So you can have a beautiful car, but with a completely cut off back is actually very efficient in terms of aerodynamics.
Yeah,
absolutely fascinating. So thanks for taking us through that today, Mike. That's the end of our first podcast. Thanks for being here with me today and taking us through that and technical detail. Next episode, we're going to have styling, and we look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you for joining us today on the Talking the Talk podcast. My thanks to Mike Keane for the interesting conversation. You can check out Mike's offering on www.mikekeane.ie, that's Keane, and check out www.irelandmay.ie to see our back catalogue of stories on Irish transport, past and present. We look forward to welcoming you to our next episode, where we'll once again be exploring the origins of automotive technology. Please subscribe to our podcast and tell your friends about it. Bye for now.